Right, so get this. Imagine you're sailing the high seas, like back in the 1600s. Not some luxury cruise or anything, but the real deal. Sun beating down, waves crashing, and suddenly, out of the mist, sails appear. Friend, foe. That was the constant dilemma in the Spanish Pacific, where pirates weren't just villains in a story, they were a shaping force in an entire empire.
It's true. It's a side of colonialism we rarely hear about. We tend to think of Spanish conquest as this straightforward march of armies. But in the Philippines, things were a lot more complicated.
Okay, so before we even get to the Spanish, set the scene for us. What was the Philippines like before they showed up?
Well, first of all, forget any ideas you might have about isolated, peaceful islands. The Philippines was already a crossroads of cultures and trade. Connected to these huge networks across Asia, you had Chinese merchants coming and going, Islamic influence spreading from the south. It was a vibrant mix.
So not exactly a quiet backwater waiting to be discovered, huh?
Not at all. And that's a crucial point. When the Spanish arrived in the mid-1500s, they weren't stepping into a vacuum. They were entering a world that was already complex, with its own power struggles, trade routes, and even, yes, pirates.
Hold on. Pirates before the Spanish? Are we talking like local rivalries or something more organized?
Both, actually. You had local groups raiding each other,
Okay.
for resources, but also connections to wider piracy networks that stretched across Southeast Asia. This was a world where seafaring and raiding were deeply intertwined with everyday life.
Wow, okay, that definitely changes the picture. So how did the Spanish fit into all of this? I mean, they were trying to build an empire, right?
Exactly. And they did eventually establish control over the Philippines, but not just through brute force. They were incredibly savvy about using the existing system to their advantage.
So not just conquering, but
Yeah.
manipulating. Give me an example. How did they do that?
Think of it like this. They saw this world of maritime raiding, and they realized they could become the power broker. They started forming alliances with certain local groups, offering protection in exchange for loyalty, of course, and then using those alliances to go after rivals.
Clever, but
Yeah.
also kind of ruthless.
Yeah.
So less about imposing their will and more about playing groups off against each other.
Exactly. They brought a new level of organization and resources to the game, but they were also building on pre-existing tensions and rivalries. It's a much more subtle form of control than just marching in and taking over.
So it sounds like these local alliances were key to their success. Was it all just about military might, though, or were there other factors at play?
There was another powerful tool in their arsenal: religion. The Spanish weren't just conquerors, they were also on a mission to convert people to Catholicism.
Right, right. The whole God, gold, and glory thing, classic colonialism. But how did that actually play out in the Philippines?
Well, for many Filipinos, accepting Christianity also meant getting protection. Protection from these pirate raids. It was a way to secure their livelihoods and their communities. And for the Spanish, this shared faith helped legitimize their rule. It created a sense of unity, even if it was built on, let's be honest, a pretty unequal power dynamic.
Okay, so they're fighting pirates together, sharing a religion. Sounds like a recipe for stability, right?
To some extent, yes, but remember, this is a world where threats are constant. And one of the biggest challenges the Spanish faced came from the Moro raiders.
Moro raiders, that's a new one. Who were they?
These were Muslim groups based in the southern Philippines, and they were incredibly skilled sailors and warriors. They posed a serious threat to Spanish control throughout their rule. And for the Spanish, this wasn't just about territory or resources. They framed the conflict as a religious war, a clash of civilizations.
Whoa, so they're using religion to rally support, painting themselves as the defenders of the faith.
Exactly. And that narrative was powerful, both for the Spanish and for many Filipinos who had converted to Catholicism. It helped to solidify Spanish authority, especially in the face of this ongoing threat.
Constant warfare, but also a kind of twisted unity. I'm getting some serious Game of Thrones vibes here. Alliances, betrayals, religious fervor. Did this protection racket, for lack of a better term, always work out for the Spanish?
Not always. In fact, there's a fascinating example of when this whole system backfired spectacularly, the Bohol Rebellion.
Okay, rebellion. That sounds juicy. Lay it on me, what happened in Bohol.
Well, imagine you're on this island, constantly being pressured to provide men and resources. For these anti-piracy campaigns, the burden is immense, and it's causing tensions with your neighbors over land, over power, all of that.
So the Spanish are creating problems, even as they're trying to solve them.
In a way, yes. And in the 1750s, all of this resentment boils over in Bohol. They revolt against the Spanish, and this rebellion drags on for decades. It shows that beneath the surface of this seemingly stable system, there was a lot of simmering anger and resistance.
Wow. So much for that unity through faith and fighting pirates idea. It's clear the Spanish had their hands full. Were there any other groups that posed a major challenge to their rule?
Oh, absolutely. And this one might surprise you. It involves the Chinese community in the Philippines. The Chinese community in the Philippines. That's interesting. I wouldn't have guessed that.
Yeah, it's kind of unexpected, right? You think traders, peaceful coexistence, all that. But remember, this is the 1600s. Fear of the other could escalate pretty quickly back then.
It's true. And in this case, that fear got tangled up with the whole pirate situation. As the Chinese population in Manila grew, the Spanish got more and more suspicious, especially after, well, this was a big deal. Chinese pirates, led by Koxinga, captured Taiwan, from the Dutch, no less. In 1662,
Hold on, rewind a sec. Chinese pirates. Strong enough to take on a European power like the Dutch.
oh, absolutely. Koxinga wasn't messing around, and this victory sent shockwaves through the entire region. The Spanish were terrified that the Chinese community in Manila might sympathize with these pirates, or even worse, rise up in support.
Yeah, I can see how that would freak them out. I mean, they're already dealing with the Moro raiders, and now this.
Yeah.
But did the Chinese in Manila actually pose a threat? Like, for real?
Well, that's where things get tricky. There's no evidence, no real proof that they were planning any kind of uprising, but the Spanish fear, fueled by, prejudice and this feeling of being surrounded by enemies, led to some truly horrific events.
Okay, I'm bracing myself. What happened?
There were 3 major massacres of the Chinese population in Manila during the 17th century. Each time, tens of thousands of people were killed. It was a brutal chapter, a truly dark chapter in the history of the Spanish Philippines, driven by paranoia and a toxic mix of racism and religious intolerance.
Wow, that's heavy stuff. It's amazing how fear can twist people's perceptions and lead to such atrocities.
It really is, and it's a reminder that even in a place as seemingly chaotic as the pirate-infested Spanish Pacific, the worst violence often stemmed from human prejudice and the abuse of power.
Makes you think, doesn't it? With all this going on, did the Spanish ever get a moment to breathe? Or was it just one crisis after another?
Well, they certainly had their hands full. And as if the Moro raiders and the fear of Chinese uprisings weren't enough, a new player entered the scene in the 18th century, the British Empire.
Oh boy, here come the Brits. And I bet they weren't just there for tea and crumpets.
Not exactly. The British were in the midst of the 7 Years' War, a global conflict with France and Spain. And they saw Manila, this crucial Spanish stronghold, as ripe for the taking.
So another layer of complexity added to the mix. Did they try the same strategy as the Spanish, making alliances with local groups and all that?
They tried to, actually. The British assumed. They assumed they'd be welcomed as liberators, freeing the Filipinos from Spanish rule. But they drastically misjudged the situation.
Hold on. The Brits thought they'd be greeted with open arms. Seriously?
I know, right? Seems pretty naive in hindsight, but they genuinely believed it. After all, they were used to playing the role of the good guys, in their colonial narratives. But for the Filipinos, who'd been dealing with Spanish rule for centuries, the British just looked like another group of outsiders trying to grab power.
So what happened when the British showed up? Did the Filipinos actually resist them?
They absolutely did. The Filipinos fought alongside the Spanish to defend Manila. They saw the British as just another threat, not as liberators. It's a fascinating example of how people's experiences and loyalties can shift in unexpected ways, depending on the circumstances.
Wow, that totally flips the script. You'd think after dealing with
Yeah.
all the demands and sometimes brutal policies of the Spanish, they might have welcomed a change.
It's tempting to assume that. But the reality was much more complex. The Filipinos had built lives and communities within the Spanish system, however flawed it might have been, and they weren't about to just switch allegiances to a new power. That was, let's be honest, acting a lot like the pirates they were supposedly there to defeat.
Okay, so the British invasion backfired. What happened next? Did things settle down after that?
Well, the British were eventually defeated, and Spanish rule was restored, but the victory came at a price. The Spanish became even more suspicious of the Chinese community in Manila, fearing they might have sided with the British. This led to further discrimination and restrictions.
It's incredible how these cycles of fear and violence just kept repeating themselves. So after all this upheaval, did the Spanish learn any lessons? Did they change their approach?
In some ways, they adapted. Remember that whole strategy of playing groups off against each other? Well, they continued to rely on that, even forging alliances with unexpected partners.
Unexpected partners like who?
Well, get this. They even reached out to the Indian state of Mysore, who were also at odds with the British at the time. It shows how global politics were already shaping events in the Spanish Pacific, even back then.
So they're playing a long game, huh? Making alliances across continents to protect their interests.
Exactly. They realized that maintaining power in such a volatile region required a network of allies, even those who might seem like unlikely partners. It's a reminder that history is rarely a simple story of good guys and bad guys, but rather a complex web of shifting relationships and motivations.
And what about the Filipinos? Were they just pawns in this game of empires? Or do they have any agency in shaping their own destinies?
That's a great question, and it's one that historians are increasingly exploring. While it's true that they were often caught in the crossfire of these larger power struggles, they weren't simply passive victims.
So how did they assert their agency? What kind of choices did they make?
Well, remember how they fought alongside the Spanish, against the British? That wasn't just about blind loyalty. They were making strategic decisions. Based on their own understanding of the situation, they chose to defend their existing way of life, even if it meant collaborating with a colonial power.
So playing the hand they were dealt? Trying to make the best of a difficult situation?
Exactly. And there are other examples of Filipinos exercising agency, negotiating with different powers, forming their own alliances, and even resisting Spanish rule in various ways. It's a more nuanced and fascinating story than the traditional colonial narratives might suggest.
This is really changing how I see the whole idea of colonialism. It's not just about one powerful nation imposing its will on another. It's about these complex interactions, these shifting alliances, and the choices that people make within those constraints.
It's about recognizing the agency of those who are often overlooked in the grand narratives of history. And it reminds us that even in the face of overwhelming power, individuals and communities can find ways to shape their own destinies.
Okay, so we've seen how the Spanish built their empire in the Philippines, how they navigated these constant threats from pirates and rival powers. But what ultimately happened to their rule? Did it last forever?
Well, every empire eventually falls, and the Spanish Philippines was no exception in the late 19th century. A confluence of factors led to their downfall.
Okay, so we've got the stage set for the fall of the Spanish Empire in the Philippines. What were the key factors that led to their downfall?
Well, internally, you had growing Filipino nationalism, a desire for independence. This had been simmering for centuries, remember, those rebellions we talked about. But by the late 1800s, it had coalesced into a powerful movement. Think of it like those cracks we saw in Bohol, now spreading throughout the entire archipelago.
So they're dealing with internal pressures. But I'm guessing there were external factors at play as well? I mean, this is the age of empires, right? Everyone's vying for control.
Exactly. And in this case, the rising power was the United States. They were looking to expand their influence in the Pacific, and they saw the Philippines as a strategic prize.
So, the Spanish, who had once been the up-and-coming empire, carving out their slice of Asia, now find themselves facing a new rival. Kind of ironic, isn't it?
It is, and it shows how the global balance of power was shifting. The Spanish were weakened by internal struggles and facing a modernizing U.S. military. It was a recipe for disaster. But here's where it gets really interesting. The legacy of piracy actually played a role in their downfall, too.
Wait, hold on. I thought we were past the era of swashbuckling pirates by this point. How did that factor in?
Not literal pirates, no, but the spirit of resistance, the idea of fighting against external control, that was deeply embedded in Filipino culture, thanks to centuries of battling pirates and other would-be conquerors, and that spirit fueled the independence movement.
So it's like the ghosts of pirates past came back to haunt the Spanish Empire?
You could say that. The memories of those struggles, the stories passed down through generations. It all contributed to this sense that Filipinos deserved to chart their own course.
It's amazing how seemingly distant events can have such a profound impact on the future. So, what was the final nail in the coffin for Spanish rule? Was there a decisive moment?
The Spanish-American War of 1898 was the turning point. The U.S. Navy crushed the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay, and after a brief but bloody conflict, Spain ceded the Philippines to the United States.
So, after over 300 years of ruling the Philippines, after all those alliances, battles, and schemes to navigate a world of pirates and rival empires, the Spanish Empire finally came to an end.
It did. And it's a reminder that even the mightiest empires are built on shaky foundations. They rise and fall, leaving behind legacies that continue to shape the world long after they're gone.
This whole deep dive has been incredible. I mean, I knew the Spanish had colonized the Philippines, But I never realized how complex and fascinating the story really was. It's about so much more than just conquest and battles. It's about human choices, shifting alliances, and the constant struggle for power and freedom.
And it challenges us to rethink how we view history. It's not just a collection of dates and names, it's about understanding the forces that shape our world, the echoes of the past that resonate in the present.
Absolutely. For all of you listening out there, I hope this deep dive has given you a new perspective on the Spanish Philippines, a place where pirates weren't just villains in a story, but a force that shaped an empire and ultimately contributed to its downfall. It's a reminder that history is full of surprises, and the more we dig, the more we realize how interconnected everything really is.
And as we've seen, it's not just about the grand narratives of empires, but about the choices that individuals and communities make within those larger systems. Those choices, those acts of resistance, collaboration, and adaptation are what truly shape the course of history.
So the next time you hear about colonialism, don't just think of conquering armies. Think about those Moro raiders, those Chinese merchants caught in the crossfire, those Filipino communities making strategic decisions. In a world of constant uncertainty, it's a much richer, more nuanced story waiting to be explored.
And that's what makes history so compelling. It's a never-ending journey of discovery, and the more we delve into these forgotten corners of the past, the more we understand ourselves and the world we live in today.
This has been an incredible journey through the Spanish Pacific, filled with pirates, intrigue, and the enduring human spirit. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.